I think a lot of times people get very intimidated by the entrepreneurial process or just all of this advice is floating around. But if you kind of return to your roots as an engineer and say, hey, I just like to build things, whether it's products or companies, just give it a shot and experiment, because the downside risk is not that bad. And the upside is pretty enormous because products are super scalable, right? Like you can get them out there. And that's a great way to have impact. So I remember 20 years ago, even back then, I wanted to go see ideas have impact in the world. You want to change the world through these ideas. The best way I found to do that is by building products. And the best way to build products is just do it. Go for it.
From Foundation Capital, this is B2B as CEO, a podcast about the startup journey, about going from idea to IPO, and growing from a founder into a CEO. On each episode, I speak with notable CEOs and founders and get their stories about what it took to build a company of scale and become a leader in the enterprise. I'm Ashu Garg, a general partner at Foundation Capital. My guest today is Sanjit Biswas, the co-founder and CEO of Samsara, a platform that helps companies digitize their physical operations. In 2023, Samsara reached $1 billion in annual recurring revenues, making it one of the fastest startups ever to hit this milestone. But this wasn't Sanjit's first big success. Before starting Samsara, he co-founded Meraki, a cloud networking company that he sold to Cisco for $1.2 billion. In this episode, Sanjit takes us on his journey from grad school researcher to two-time founder and CEO. He shares the lessons he learned bootstrapping Meraki and pivoting to serve enterprise customers, along with the thought process behind selling to Cisco. We then explore how Samsara found product market fit, Sanjit's approach to allocating capital, and how he grew from a technical founder to a seasoned CEO. We wrap with his thoughts on where generative AI will have the biggest impact. It was a really fun and insightful discussion that I think you'll enjoy. Here's my conversation with Sanjit. First of all, thank you so much for joining B2B as CEO today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Maybe we can just start with your story a little bit. How you got started. You've started two very successful companies, but just start with your overall life story.
Sure. I'll try to make it quick. But I started out as an engineer. I studied electrical engineering, computer science, both as an undergrad at Stanford and then as a grad student at MIT. Actually had not planned on being an entrepreneur. My original intent was to be an I was planning to go finish my Ph.D. and teach. But along the way, we built some pretty cool technology as part of our Ph.D. research. My co-founder, John, and I were in a lab together and basically building Wi-Fi networks. That was our PhD research. And that's what turned into our first company, which was Meraki. And happy to talk more about that, but kind of putting that concept in a box, like how do you build really big Wi-Fi networks that could serve a lot of people? And this is about 20 years ago. And then from there, we started Meraki, which was our first startup company. Grew that to some significant scale. Meraki was acquired by Cisco in 2012, which is a little over a decade ago. And more recently, we've focused, my co-founder John and I have focused on the world of physical operations with Samsara. So not so much the world of IT, which we knew very well from our networking work, but really the world of infrastructure. So think supply chains and construction companies and energy utilities and so on. How can we build technology for them? So the through line there is building technology to go have impact. First, it was around networks and Wi-Fi. Now it's around physical operations, but it's all about going and changing the world through some pretty awesome technology and product.
That's a great story. And, John and you have worked together twice, which is not common. So I definitely want to come back to that. But let's start with the Meraki story. So both of you were doing this research on Wi-Fi networks, give or take 20 years ago in a lab, and Wi-Fi was very nascent at the time. Walk us through the journey of starting a company from that research.
Well, it's hard to imagine a world before Wi-Fi, but 20 years ago, like you said, Wi-Fi was a brand new technology. Back then, most people still connected their computers to an Ethernet cable to get online. But once we saw the technology, and this was sort of emerging in the early 2000s, we knew it was going to be game-changing, right, in terms of how people wanted to get online. And we also saw smart devices coming on the horizon. So we knew that this like high-speed connectivity over wireless was going to be really important. So the research we were doing was around network routing. So how do you build a really big network, serve hundreds or thousands of clients, make sure the bandwidth is allocated fairly? How do you route traffic through the network and keep it stable and make it really high quality? We did that by kind of getting hands-on. So we built a network that was called RoofNet, and as you can probably guess from the name, it was a rooftop Wi-Fi network. It covered all of Cambridge, Mass, basically from the MIT campus up to Harvard. And we were, poor grad students. We had a lot of empathy for our fellow grad students. We thought, well, maybe we can build a network that provides free internet because that would be so useful. And so that's what we built for the first, 4 or 5 years of our PhD. We actually built and operated a live network, and that's what got our hands dirty with the real world challenges of networking. But towards the end of that, we figured out a way to shrink the hardware from what were pretty expensive research prototypes, like $3,000 a radio, to pretty inexpensive, almost product scale boards that were about $50. And so we said, wow, this could be really game changing for everyone if we can take this RoofNet technology and literally put it in a box so other people can build big networks in a plug and play sort of way. So that was the genesis of Meraki, was that insight of, could you take this technology and this new way of building networks and make it super easy for people to build a big Wi-Fi network and cover their school or apartment complex or campus with connectivity.
So very powerful insight, and again, as you rightly said, it's hard to imagine today, but if you rewind the clock, Wi-Fi was not as common at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
enterprises in particular struggled with exactly the problem that you're describing, which is, I have large campuses, I need to manage Wi-Fi performance across different buildings, different parts of buildings, different
Right.
applications within those networks. So again, in hindsight, it makes so much sense. But at the time when it was new, how did you go about the process of going from, okay, I have a network, I have some boards at work, to getting a company off the ground? Did investors just find you, or did you have to go out and find them?
Well, it's an interesting story to kind of reflect back on, because when we were getting started, like I said, John and I were PhD students. We actually didn't know a lot of people doing startups. This is in the aftermath of the dot-com bust, and everyone had sort of scattered at that point, right? Like, it was very hard to start a company. And for context, we were in Boston, so we were not here in Silicon Valley. We were still living in Boston. We didn't have a big network, and we didn't have any money, to be really frank. Like, we were grad students, so we ended up bootstrapping the company in the very early days. We basically found folks that wanted this product so badly, they're willing to prepay for the hardware so that we could get it manufactured. So we found some nonprofits that wanted to put free Wi-Fi in, like, low-income housing. There was the One Laptop Per Child initiative, if you remember that. They became a partner of ours. Google was doing free Wi-Fi in San Francisco and a couple of pilot cities. So we ended up partnering with them. And we kind of were able to scrape together these pre-orders from all of these early customers and literally bootstrap the company. And we had to, because we were making hardware. The only way to get the hardware made is we had to put a down payment or deposit with the manufacturer. And so it was really we were like problem solving and working backwards from, like, how do we get this order placed? And that's how we got off the ground in the summer of 2006. And then from there, once we got the first boards made, we were able to put them online, put them in a case, and so on. And then we were able to start selling them, and the product just started taking off on its own. But it's kind of counterintuitive, because I think a lot of people assume we went and raised venture capital, but we didn't have that network, we didn't have that access, so we just figured it out by selling, essentially.
I mean, that's quite the story. I mean, hardware in particular, as you said, is orders of magnitude more complex to get off the ground than software. You actually do need capital to sort of pay the vendors, and so
We were true, like, grad students. We never sold anything in our lives. Like, we never done commercial business before, and so we had to figure out a lot of, like, how do you go deal with the supplier, how do you come up with the cash to build the boards, not in addition to building the stuff, of course. And then I remember one of the early conversations with Google. They got pretty excited and they said, we'd love to give you a PO for, I think it was 3,000 units or something like that. I was like, awesome. What's a PO? And, like, how do you cash that sort of thing, right? So there was a lot that we had to figure out as at the time we were just true engineers.
so going from really just getting off the ground with this free network sort of in 2006, doing your San Francisco project in 2007.
Hmm.
And then, fast forward 5 years, you sold for over $1 billion to Cisco. Uh, what are the two or three highlights of that journey?
Well, I can tell you one highlight was maybe a challenging time, which is 2008. So everyone remembers there's a big global financial crisis. We as a startup had gotten off the ground. We had that sort of initial customer base, and we were doubling revenue and roughly operating around a break even. So we weren't burning a ton of cash, but a lot of the projects we were doing were kind of out there in terms of being cutting edge. So free Wi-Fi across the city or a town kind of thing. The reason I bring that up is in 2008, because of the financial crisis, all of a sudden our pipeline of projects with customers dried up because people didn't have money to try speculative things. They were kind of hunkering down. So as a startup, we kind of experienced a shockwave of, wow, our sales pipeline is going to be in jeopardy and we're not going to be able to make our numbers unless we pivot the business. And so in 08, 09, we made a pivot with Meraki towards the enterprise. So before it was all kind of prosumer and hobbyists, like free Wi-Fi, which is a cool concept, but didn't have a big addressable market. And we said, what we could probably do to pay the bills and keep the business growing is pivot to the enterprise, make it easy for people to build big campus networks in a more traditional sense, which of course had a different price point as well.
Yep.
But once we did that, we were able to really fire up the growth engine of the company. And that was something that was pretty uncomfortable for us because before we were kind of selling online. It was a web store. It was very easy to kind of just put product out there and see it go. Enterprise sales was completely different and really foreign to us. So we had to figure out how to pick up the phone and call people and pitch a product and do these like fairly large transactions. But once we got the hang of it, it really kind of got the company off the ground with Meraki. And we started more than doubling revenue every year to the point where we got to about $100 million run rate prior to the acquisition.
That's a very hard transition for most founders, and in particular, as you said, technical founders doing their first startup. If you look back, are there one or two lessons or pieces of advice you would have for founders making that journey today?
Yeah, more than one or two probably. But I would say that the first one was that we learned a lot just by doing. It's one thing to kind of read books and read blog posts about how things are done. It's another thing just to jump in and like literally pick up the phone and try to sell the product. And at the time, we were sort of forced into it because we knew that we needed to make that pivot in order to keep the business growing. And that discomfort, I think, was actually a great source of growth for both me and John. John was our CTO. He's our CTO at Samsara as well. At some point, John also wanted to figure out inside sales. He literally put on a suit. He was like a method actor. He like put on a suit, came in. We both got like call lists, and we picked up the phone and called. And that built a tremendous amount of empathy. We're not the best salespeople by any means, but we started to really understand the process. And being engineers, we were able to turn it into a scientific process where we said, well, if we make 70 calls, we get this many, demos, which turns into this many appointments and trials, which then turns into this many transactions. So we realized actually this is pretty simple. We just need to do it. So that was maybe lesson bundle number one. And then, the second area was really around the team. You can't do it alone. Like you could have the best co-founder, but you're really only two or three people. You actually need to start building a whole team around you to get the leverage and the scale. And that means you need to turn into more of a leader than just an engineer. And that's the true pivot to being a CEO, I think.
Well, tell me more about that transition for you more so than John, but for both of you. How do you really think about sort of leadership as the key attribute or where you're spending your time versus doing yourself?
Well, if you think practically, and a lot of technical founders are very good engineers, right? Like you're folks that really know the technology, know how to build product. And so there's a natural tendency to want to like still be hands on keyboards and like building the product yourself, which can be a really awesome competitive advantage because sometimes you see something that nobody else sees in the market.
Yep.
At some point, though, you could be, a 10x or 50x engineer or whatever you want to sort of classify it as, but you can't get enough leverage unless you go and have a team of 50 engineers or 100 engineers. At that point, it becomes way more effective to explain to people what you're trying to build and the vision, and then do the product management of like, these are the key things we have that will have the most impact. And then talk to customers and close the feedback loop. That's something that's actually very hard to do if you're writing code all day long. So that for me was a big pivot, which was spending time with customers, taking those ideas, testing them with customers, bringing them back to product and engineering, and then running a feedback loop over and over.
And for many engineers, that's actually it's hard. Like your comfort zone is writing code. Your comfort zone is deep work, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. Uh, and I see this with many founders that they intellectually understand they need to spend more time with customers, but they keep reverting back
Right.
to their comfort zones. How did you fight that, or did you have to, or maybe you didn't have to fight that?
Well, I wouldn't say fight that was is the right way that I would frame it. I think it's more of your habits shift, right? So, like literally, I was an engineer that would love to stay up late because you can just concentrate. You'd stay up until 2 a.m. building something, but then a lot of our meetings would be happening at 8 a.m. So eventually, you start like burning the candle at both ends. You're like, I have to pick one. But what I found is you have a really unique advantage as a technical founder, which is you can talk in a deep way about the product and you can get ideas about what to build next from talking to customers. So once you get the hang of that and get into that, it becomes very natural to want to spend more time out on the front lines, out with customers. So I would say to early founders, generally, like you learn by doing, right? In the same way that you learn by hacking on something or building it, you learn by getting out there and spending time with customers. And when you do that, it becomes kind of addicting in a good way where you say, wow, I want to get even more customer insight. I want to solve even more problems, have more impact. And that becomes the beginning of a pretty exciting flywheel.
Absolutely. And so if we fast forward a little bit, I mean, you got to 100 million in run rate revenues at Meraki before you sold.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about some of the lessons from this first step of really finding product market fit with enterprises? And, in a relatively short period of time, getting to 100 million in revenues, uh, what were some of the lessons learned along that journey?
Well, a couple would be just the importance of finding the common patterns in a big market. So, Wi-Fi at that point in time, mid 2000s, was starting to take off. The iPad and the iPhone had been introduced, so kind of bring your own device was a big challenge for customers. And we were hearing that across different industry verticals. So we heard it in K-12 schools, right? They were putting iPads and laptops in the classroom. You'd hear it in corporate office spaces with law firms and accounting firms saying we have vendors that come in, they need to get online. You'd hear it in healthcare where they had connected devices. So it was actually really interesting to hear the same challenges across different industries and say, wow, what we need to do is build something that makes it really easy for people to get secure guest access on their Wi-Fi network while also having a separate enterprise, closed network. That's the kind of thing that we just saw it. It became pretty obvious, and that when we built the product for it, we made the product easy that you didn't need a computer science PhD to configure a network. It just took off. So, I think finding that product market fit is really key and then doing it over and over because we didn't just build one product, by the way. I've talked a lot about Meraki's Wi-Fi. Meraki actually built switches and routers and device management. We kind of built out a whole platform. And customers love that because they said, wow, finally I can just, I have networks that simply work. This stuff just goes out. I
Yep.
can put it in all my branch locations and all of a sudden they could be super leveraged. Like they didn't need a networking team of 20 people. They just needed 2 people and they could run the whole thing. So that product market fit was so compelling that I think it gave us a massive tailwind. And it also was very forgiving in terms of us figuring out all these details of selling and running a business.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit towards the end of the Meraki story. At some point, you get an offer from Cisco. It's an attractive offer, but the company is doing really well. How did you think about the decision to sell versus keep going on your own? And
Yeah. Certainly not an easy decision, especially when things are working really well. You really don't want to
yeah,
sell at that point. We actually had planned to take the company public, and we were kind of gearing up for that. We just hired a CFO that had been a public company CFO. We were gearing up for the whole S1 process. And that's, I think, what actually triggered the approach by Cisco is they heard that the company had achieved scale, products were doing really well in the market, and we were getting ready to go out. And they basically said, look, this is the point in time where it makes sense for you to think about it because public public kind of merger is much more complicated, et cetera. But stepping back, the market dynamics are really important to sort of remember here, which is we were kind of born 25 years too late to be at the beginning of the networking party, right? Like Cisco Systems was already a
yeah,
super large company. We're talking 30, $40 billion in revenue. They had, I think at the time, 30,000 reseller partners, channel partners, which means that there were over 1 million people out there selling Cisco product, right? And so we were a relatively small company. We were doing really well at 100 million, but we had a small team. We had a small base of channel partners. And our biggest competitor at the time was Cisco because they were the incumbent. So essentially, the pitch was, you guys have built an amazing product. It's doing really well. Think about what it could do if you were able to run it through the Cisco channel, right? And get it out there at a global scale. And so that was effectively the pitch to us, was like, you could have much more impact with this. And there's this window of opportunity where this stuff really is going to make a difference for the customer. Let's get it out there together. So that was the sort of what made it interesting conceptually. And then numbers wise, back then, valuations were pretty different. Again, this is coming out of the global financial crisis. So multiples at the time, I think we'd maybe raised our last round of financing at 400 million. And Cisco came with an offer that was ultimately about 1.2 billion. So it was a significant sort of credit for great execution. So that's what kind of made it make sense. Is we said, well, it would be amazing to get these products out there under the Cisco logo in the channel and see what it could do. And Cisco is effectively giving us credit for perfect execution for a couple more years.
Makes sense, especially in those days, $1 billion, $1.2 billion acquisition was pretty rare.
Very rare. Yeah.
If you fast forward to today, before we switch gears to the Samsara story, how do you feel about having sold the company?
People ask me, do you regret it or any of that kind of stuff? And I still think it was one of the best decisions we made because the pitch came true. The products have had massive impact. And even to this day, I still take a lot of pride in the Meraki products. A lot of our customers at Samsara run Meraki, and you see the product everywhere. So, for example, if I go to grab a coffee at Starbucks, I look up and I see the Meraki access point. Or you go at my kids' schools, like, we weren't any part of this, but you just look up and there's access point. It's really cool. So it's fun to see that. It's a multi-billion-dollar business in terms of annual revenue now, and I think it's been one of the most successful acquisitions done by Cisco. So I feel really proud of the work that we did, and also the work we did after the acquisition to make sure that it continued to be successful. And the team's done a great job just scaling that business up.
No, it's truly been a remarkable acquisition for Cisco, and as you rightly said, it's everywhere.
Yeah,
I'm going to fast forward in the interest of time to the
sure.
Samsara story. You've sold a company, you've made a fair bit of money, maybe more than you thought you would when you started the company. So what's next? How did you decide on Samsara?
Yeah. So it's funny to kind of think back on it because, like you said, we'd sold the company. We actually continued to work super hard post acquisition to make sure it integrated well. And then we realized, we hadn't really taken a break. So we had a kind of a 2-year commitment to Cisco where we said we're going to integrate this and make sure it scales. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I was a grad student at MIT, and technically speaking, we went on leave when we started Meraki. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go back and finish my PhD and go back to writing papers and see how that whole thing goes. And this was me. John was a little bit different. John's like, there's no way that's going to work. But I was like, no, I really want to finish this thing. I want to try it. So actually, in between Meraki and Samsara, we wrote an academic research paper using a bunch of the data and the scale that we had, and submitted it to one of the conferences, and it actually got in. But the funny part was we submitted the paper and almost forgot about it because the academic sort of feedback loop cycle is 6 months to get peer reviewed, feedback and so on. So anyway, the review came back several months later. Paper got in. At that point, we were like, okay, that's a pretty long feedback cycle because we'd gotten used to customer feedback cycles, which was you just build something and send it over to them and they tell you what they thought immediately. So we said, okay, well maybe the right way to go have impact is to go build product and do that sort of thing. But it was not an immediate step. We took a couple of months off, and I encourage every entrepreneur that has had an exit to do that. Take the vacation because most founders don't. Right, you're just running super hard. And we actually took the time to get bored again, which is where I think a lot of good ideas come from because it lets you recenter and say, what is the most important thing that I can work on? How can I be useful in this world? And for us, that meant going into physical operations because we said, it's an underserved market. There's a lot of opportunity for impact. I don't think we would have done that if we went straight from Cisco into starting a company. We probably would have done something in IT. And I don't think we would have had as much impact if we had gone down that route.
And did you look at 4 or 5 different ideas before deciding on physical operations, or it sort of naturally happened as you were, ruminating, starting to get bored?
Yeah, it was pretty natural for us. We were kind of curious nerds by nature, and so we were reading a bunch of different things. And I remember I personally got really fascinated by the infrastructure of the planet because I was curious. What drives emissions, right? Like where do all the carbon emissions come from? Turns out a huge fraction of it is from manufacturing and the utilities and so on, because it's literally what's powering our planet. So I kept finding my way back to, wow, there's all these challenges in infrastructure, but we didn't know any entrepreneurs or startup founders that were working on those problems. We knew lots of people targeting the enterprise. We knew lots of people doing consumer. We didn't know anyone thinking about operations. So that's how we found our way there. And we actually had met the customer before in our past life at Meraki because they were all buying Wi-Fi. Like everyone needed Wi-Fi for their warehouses and yards and so on. But when you'd set foot on site, it was like a time machine. You didn't know if it was like 2015 or 1995 or 1975 in some cases, like pen and paper clipboards. People were planning their routes with big maps on the walls. They're making phone calls to find everyone. So that's when we knew we could be useful here. We could build technology and go have an impact.
That's a great starting point. And we'll talk through the story in a little more detail, but maybe just for the listeners, if you could describe what Samsara does in a couple of sentences.
Sure. So, kind of starting with that customer, we're helping digitize that world of physical operations. So, if you think about a logistics company or energy utility or construction company, they have a lot of people and they have a lot of assets. And so they're trying to find ways to be smarter in their operations. And in this day and age, everyone understands the power of data, but it's really hard to go and see what's going on when you have thousands of people across hundreds of different job sites and so on. So what we're able to do is build a whole platform for them to get that data into the cloud. We see the patterns in that data using modern technologies like AI, and then we help them take action. So we can help break bad habits that lead to risk, right? So if you have a big fleet of vehicles, we can help train drivers to not look at their mobile phone or wear their seatbelt or not follow as closely. That reduces the number of accidents they get into. That in turn, helps prevent a lot of bad stuff from happening on the road, saves these companies millions of dollars in insurance costs, and it actually improves their overall safety. So that's the kind of impact we're able to have with the data. And the way we do it is by providing the whole system. So we provide everything they need to get the data into the cloud. We provide the apps, we provide the dashboards, and that's how we drive impact in the world, is by making it easy for these companies to modernize and digitize.
As you were describing Samsara, one of the things that struck me was how many similarities there are, very different markets, but how many similarities there are between the Meraki model, the end-to-end platform for a customer that didn't necessarily understand all the bits and bytes of Wi-Fi, versus in this case, an even less sophisticated customer, I would imagine, with regards to technology, and you're providing them an end-to-end solution, hardware, software. There's probably cloud components, client components. Was that a conscious choice, or did that just naturally evolve into that at Samsara?
Yeah, I think it was a very natural evolution or pattern. It goes without saying, we knew how to build this style of product because of our experience at Meraki. So we weren't intimidated by the idea that people will need hardware to get this data into the cloud. That was one of our big insights. Was I think the Internet of Things had been a concept that everyone had been excited about, but didn't quite happen, didn't quite materialize. Is because it was hard, right? Like the customers would have to go take all these Lego building blocks and piece them together, and they weren't set up to do that. They didn't have a big IT team. They didn't have enough programmers and engineers. So by making a product where we did it for them, we were able to make it easy. And so they had the need, they had the desire to get the data. We made it easy for them to just plug in the gateways and get the data to the cloud. And then the same thing with the analytics. Everyone knows there's a lot of value in this data, but analyzing it, finding, like training the machine learning models, getting workflows and actions to really work well, requires a significant amount of engineering effort. We were able to make that investment because we were familiar with it. We had the capability to do it, and that's how we had impact with the customer. So you're right that there's some interesting similarities. I think it was a pattern match for us where we said, like this is how we could do it, and this is how we can do it across industries.
And you chose a very broad space. I mean, physical operation, there's lots of possible things you could do. Uh, how did you decide what specific customer problems to focus on? Did you have a framework for that, or was that a more organic process?
It was very organic because with this company, like I said, we started market first. We didn't have a specific product or technology in mind. We said there's a set of problems that we can be helpful with. So the first thing we did is we learned by doing. So we just built a beta product, which was the kind of the simplest sensor we could think of, which is a temperature sensor, basically. So think a Bluetooth sensor that connected to a cellular gateway, which you'd plug in and would relay data to the cloud. So our first product was actually for food and beverage companies and anyone with temperature sensitive assets like pharmaceutical companies and so on. That gave us an opportunity to go on site with them and understand their operations. And we thought what we might be able to help with is detecting refrigeration failures, right? Like that, it would be damaging a lot of product. And we just assumed that, that should be a problem. It should work. And what we found in our beta process was, at least in 2015, these fridges had gotten really good. They just didn't fail. And so it was a little bit of a bit of a bummer. Like we thought it was going to be easy. We'll just make this product and the company will take off. But what was interesting is those same beta testers or early customers, they helped us realize the real challenge was in the field. It wasn't in the warehouse where their fridge was failing. It was in the delivery van where the driver was leaving the doors open and the heat would come in and ruin product. That was something which we didn't have an intuition for because we'd never driven trucks, we'd never worked in kind of operations before. But the customers told us about it, and then they started saying, is it okay for us to put these temperature sensors on vans? We said, of course, go for it. And then they would come back to us and say, well, we can see when things are going wrong, but we can't see where. Could you do GPS tracking? And we say, oh yeah, absolutely. So we'd go get a GPS device off Amazon, plug it in, write the firmware, show up the next Monday and be like, let us know what you think. And so that's how we started the feedback loop, was really by getting our hands dirty and spending time with these folks in operations.
So you started off in the warehouses, you moved, customers drew you to sort of the trucks themselves. But still at the beginning, you were doing temperature sensing in the trucks, and then you added the GPS component. How did you sort of, today what you do is very different.
Yeah, I would say we got into the truck and then we started seeing all these other challenges. These drivers were shuffling like endless amounts of paper, whether it was for the walk around inspection before they started their shift to make sure everything was okay, or when they would show up on site getting signatures from customers. There were actually a lot of compliance, so new rules started to go in place of like how long you could be working. And we saw that, we said there should be an app for that, right? No one should be shuffling paper in the 2000s. And so that was another insight, was mobile apps. And then from there, the customers started falling in love with the concept of a platform. They said, this is great. It's one system. We don't need to be in all these different point solutions. Can you also do X and can you also do Y? So we expanded into a multi-product company fairly early, and I'm happy to talk about that. But we were only a few $1 million in revenue. It was already clear this was going to be a platform, not a single application.
And a platform that had both, again, hardware and software. Talk through that decision a little bit, because most investors probably told you, hey, you're too early to have multiple products. In order to have a platform, you've got to have a killer app. You probably heard some version of that feedback, at least from investors.
Yeah, in retrospect, I don't think we really asked investors, should we build multiple products? We just did it. And it was because it was so clear to us from a pattern matching perspective that the customers could really benefit. And I'll give you an example. We started with the telematics product line in earnest. The GPS tracking was really application number one. We were having hundreds of these customer conversations, and we started hearing from many of these customers or prospects at the time, this solution looks great. We love real-time GPS. That's really a game changer. Hey, is there a dash camera system that you recommend that integrates really well with your product? And if you hear that like a dozen times, you say, well, if we built a dash cam, would you use it? And they say, yeah, absolutely, because it would be so useful to see it all in one place. So that's how we built product line number two, which became our safety business, which is now our number one license. So these are both businesses that are hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue now. The sort of seed crystal, or the very beginning of those businesses, came from those customer conversations where they said, could you do this as well? So it was really in that first year that it became clear to us we should build a camera. And then we did. And then once we had the camera, we said, well, we should put AI models on this to go detect risk. And we just kind of, it snowballed from there.
That makes sense. It's a very unique story. I mean, most technical founders start with a technical insight or sort of some market or domain that they have, worked in. And in your case, it really was just first principles. I mean, you found a very, very large market, a ridiculously large market, and you followed the customers into the problem set. Because obviously, as you said, you've never driven trucks before or hadn't really thought about how to manage warehouses or trucking fleets. Uh, if you fast forward, you started off with the GPS tracking, then cameras. Is there a third act after that as well?
There is. So we basically built application after application, but it sits on the same kind of data platform. So we did GPS tracking. We did the driver safety products and the safety coaching. We also now do equipment monitoring. So there are a lot of different assets out in the field that aren't trucks. If you think about trailers or generators, compressors, like all the other kinds of tools that are out there, construction equipment like bulldozers and excavators, we can bring all of that onto the same platform. Same customer, by the way. If you're a big construction company, you have a lot of everything. And then around workflows and apps, I mentioned compliance, for example. There's a lot of pen and paper still in operations. And so digitizing that. And then related to that, managing those devices that are mobile devices. So all of this sits on the same Samsara Connected Operations Cloud, but they're different application licenses that customers can buy from us.
Got it. And you're possibly the fastest company in recent history to get to $1 billion in revenues. So there's a lot more than just building amazing products that's required to get there. So I'd love to switch from the product strategy aspect to building the organization, building your sales channel. Obviously, you had some experience with that at Meraki, and so there's probably a lot of learnings that you could build off. But talk through that journey, which is a challenging one for most technical founders.
Yeah, it is. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but because we'd been through this at Meraki, we knew what product market fit looked and felt like from a sales perspective, right? Like once you see that traction with customers, we knew that it made sense to double down and invest. So it has been amazing the speed at which we've been able to grow revenue, but I don't think it would have been possible if we were first time founders because it would have felt too risky to lean in and build a pretty big direct sales force, so early in the business. So we got lucky with that experience, but we also had a team that we'd worked with before at Meraki, many of whom wanted to go do another startup adventure together. So we also had the benefit of having sort of a cash hit of recruiting that,
Yep.
in the early days as we were building up our sales team, there were just a lot of people that wanted to work together again. So we were able to get off the ground quickly. I don't remember the ARR numbers exactly, but my vague recollection is I think we did roughly $1 million in ARR the first year we were selling product. That grew to 16 or 17, and then 69 or 70 million the year after. So it was a really rapid ramp, which again would only be possible if you knew what it looked like and you had folks that could help out, because there's no way that a small team can sell that much product at once.
So you clearly had the benefit of, as you said, a network of people that were ready to join and who had worked with each other already, who had shared trust, some similarities in sales approach, sales channel. So the people part, you had a unique advantage which most founders wouldn't have. Having done one company before, you made the strategic decision to lean in and invest relatively faster than perhaps many founders might. Both, huge advantages. Are there other strategic choices you made that when you look back, these are the one or two things that really were turning points for the company?
Yeah. On the sales note, while we had the access to talent and really sales leadership to help us build the team up, the sales motion was actually pretty different than Meraki. So Meraki was sold through the networking channel. There were a bunch of value-added resellers that were essentially trusted partners that the customers already had relationships with for buying all their other networking equipment. So Meraki was another word, and Cisco is a channels business, right? 90+% of the business ran through the channel. With Samsara, what we realized is the operations buyer actually preferred to buy direct. They wanted a direct relationship with the vendor because they didn't have a technology partner that was helping them out. So it was a pretty different motion in the sense of like we had to go transact directly with the customer. And what we discovered along the way was that was a much more powerful feedback loop for us because we were in every single commercial conversation, and you got to learn about their business. You got to learn what sort of challenges they had. And that actually, I would say, strengthened the power of our feedback loop. in a way that we didn't have at Meraki because it was kind of arm's length. It was indirect in that sense. So that was a strategic insight that kind of came along the way. But I have to say it was different because direct sales, you need a lot more people. You just need, you have to build out a pretty large sales force to be able to drive large revenue numbers a year or two later.
So that journey of building a much larger sales force,
Mm-hmm.
probably hiring a lot of other infrastructure in the company to support
Yeah.
that, which was different from Meraki. When you look back, are there, one or two mistakes that come to mind, and you're looking like, what was I thinking at the time?
Yeah. How much time do we have on the podcast? We make a ton of mistakes. The good news, just kind of stepping back in the same way, and kind of like the venture business, there's sort of power law outcomes when it comes to good decisions in startups. So for us, the good decisions were the market we chose to focus on, the products that we invested in, the sales approach, all that kind of stuff. The mistakes we made along the way, we made tons of feature bets that didn't work out. So we would try a product here, try a product there, and that didn't stick with the customer because we realized even if the technology is really great, maybe it's too hard to integrate, or maybe every industry is a little bit different. So we had a couple of those along the way. For example, we built a computer vision system for manufacturing lines. So we could basically inspect products that were going through manufacturing line, tell you if there are defects. Turns out that's a really challenging physical problem to get the lighting right, and lines get reconfigured and things get washed down. We didn't know all that stuff. So we tried it, it didn't work. But what did work was our dash camera, right, which I talked about earlier. But running similar kinds of AI models to assess driver risk and safety was technically very, very similar to what we were doing with machine vision on the factory floor, but something that was much more repeatable because it turns out we all drive on the same roads, right? So that's the kind of thing where it's like the mistake actually wasn't that costly and the upside was exponential. It was amazing.
Got it. And you've talked in prior podcasts, and in some of your other presentations about this notion of an allergy test that you have for product market fit. I'd love for you to share that with the listeners.
Yeah, I think most technical founders have lots of ideas, right? And then there's a question of like, which ones do you invest in and which ones do you cut? And especially like there are a few of us in the company that have worked together for a long time. We're constantly brainstorming, like we should build this, we should build that. So we do effectively customer advisory boards. So we'll mock up a bunch of different ideas and just show them to the prospects or existing customers of, hey, does this make sense, or does this sort of solve the right problem for you? But allergy tests, the way we think about it is the customers will just like kind of jump out of their seat when they see something that's really compelling. They'll say, yes, I could totally use that. Or like, can I buy that now? Right. Sort of thing. And when you hear that, that's the super strong signal of like, that's the one we should build. And then we build it with the customer. So while the initial reaction is, I need that, we say, okay, how would you use it? Or like, does your frontline need this, or is it the back office? Like you kind of get into details. So the allergy panel is the sort of initial kind of menu, essentially, of like what's going to be interesting. But then we refine it based on the feedback loop.
Got it. And that's the starting point for a lot of the product decisions, it sounds like. Uh, but you've also talked a lot about your capital allocation framework, the 70-20-10 framework. How do the two connect? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is again a kind of practical challenge that teams have, which is, hey, we have a lot of ideas we want to invest in. Should we put it all in the frontier stuff, like the brand new exciting idea, or there's kind of an infinite list of feature improvements and things that the customers would like for the existing product. So the framework that we use is called it's 70-20-10. So 70% goes to the core. That's what improves the platform and benefits all the products, but might be enterprise grade features or reporting or APIs, that kind of thing. 20% are basically the near term functionality improvements, right? So we're going to add these new features that were already on the roadmap kind of for the next year or two, maybe even three. And then 10% is the risk allocation, which is these are kind of the crazy ideas that maybe aren't going to be consensus where everyone agrees with them, but we believe there's something there. Maybe there's a couple of early adopter customers who are going to help us lead the way. But we think 3 to 5 years from now, it's going to be really important that we invested there. We talked about a couple of the examples, but our APIs, for example, on the Samsara platform were a kind of risky idea when we started because none of the customers were comfortable with data integrations and APIs. This is an operations buyer. They're not used to doing them. But we felt like there was going to be some value there for the customer to connect many different systems together. And now we have 270 of these API integrations that we've done. And it's a huge source of value for our customers. That was effectively risk capital in the early days where we said we're going to build and maintain a pretty robust platform API functionality. And we think that it's going to pay off for us 5 years down the road, and it did.
Got it. That's very helpful because that it's always a hard balance, and it sounds like there's no perfect answer, but you found a framework to think through those trade-offs.
And 70-20-10 sounds really simple and sounds really clean. It's really hard to get that capital allocation to work because in a given year, your budgets might be crunched or you're fixing something or building something new. So it moves around a little bit. We don't always hit it, but it's kind of what we aspire to do is have a portfolio strategy.
We've talked a lot about sort of product decisions you've made and how you've made the decisions and how you've a lot of the choices you've made. There's a set of decisions you made around sort of go to market, the choice to go direct in this case, recruit a lot of people you had worked with, so you had a core group of people who you had shared trust and who had trust with each other. Uh, are there one or two other sort of aspects of the business that when you look back and say these were critical to this journey of getting to $1 billion in revenues in such short order?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ingredients to a successful venture. Another one was who we chose to work with sort of at the board level, right? So we did raise capital for Samsara, and it was pretty significant because of the build that was required for the direct sales force and the hardware components and so on. So there's this big sort of area or cash trough under the curve. We're now cash flow positive, but we needed venture capital to take that risk. We ended up having a great board that was really focused on that kind of long-term value as opposed to, hey, we need to see this kind of return in this time frame. That was never the discussion. It was like, can we go find something really significant, go have a massive impact and make it sustainable? So I think that was maybe an important area, and we can go more into that. And then culture is something else that as you scale becomes really important. And I think in the early days of a company, the culture is very organic. It's just how you work is quite literally how everyone's working together in the same room. As we became hundreds and now thousands of people, we had to get much more deliberate about our values as a company, like what we care about, and then also how we get things done. Because you've got an engineering team, you've got a sales team, you've got a finance team. They have to kind of work in a common way and show up for the customer in the same way. So that's something else that became really important to us that I'm glad we invested in, which is the culture of the company.
I'd love to dig into that a little bit more because, as I've done this podcast over years and sort of worked with companies myself as an investor, everyone would agree with what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
which is at some point, I think of it as, especially north of 10 million, you really do need to get very deliberate about decisions related to culture. And at the same time, I think almost every CEO struggles with what does that mean? As an engineer,
Yeah.
you're much more comfortable with things that you can put an analytical framework around, and culture is obviously hard to put into a purely analytical framework. How did you think about that question? What are some choices you had to make? Some mistakes you made along the way?
Yeah. So I think with culture, you can sort of think of it as the shared code that everyone's running, right? Like, folks are operating different parts of the company, but the how you do things should be kind of similar. And so for us, we have what we call operating principles. One of them, for example, is sample the customer experience. If you're in sales or in customer success, it's quite literal, right? Like you just want to make sure you have a good understanding of what's going on for the customer. But if you're in engineering or maybe you're in finance or another G&A function, your customer may be an internal customer. And that's fine too. We just want to make sure that you're kind of core sampling, checking out like, what does this look like at the end of the day? That's something that everybody in the company can do. But if you don't spell it out, you might be recruiting people from different companies where they're like, yeah, we just do what we think we want to do, right? Like lots of companies run in different ways. So kind of just defining what is this sort of shared way of doing things makes a big difference. And the practical problem you're solving is if your company is working, you're probably scaling your headcount really quickly. For us, we'll add 30-40% headcount in a given year. So if you think about it over 2 years, you have half your company is new, right? So that's why you need to be deliberate about it and explain it, because otherwise people will come with whatever the cultural framework was at company X they worked at, or Google or Meta or wherever. And every company has a different way of doing things. So that's the practical problem you're solving. But you're right. There's no kind of scientific dashboard that you can use to say, like, how are we doing on culture? Are we at 100% or 88% or whatever?
And if you go look back, in the journey, as you said, the core issue is you literally have half the company in any span of 18 months between some attrition and explosive hiring, half the company is new. And in the most explosive growth periods, probably, half the company is new in 9 months.
You've got that, and the business that everyone is sitting on top of is completely different than it was a couple of years ago, right? So now, like you said, Samsara is over $1 billion in revenue. A couple of years ago, we were a few hundred million, and a few years before that, we were like single digits. So the way that you need to operate is probably different at those three different scales. So also rewiring the culture of the company is needed for the right stage of the business. It's also about seeing what's working and then kind of distilling it down and then putting it back out there. So this was never something where it was an academic or intellectual exercise of like, what do we want the culture to be? It's actually more of like, hey, this is what's worked for Samsara. Let's see if we can kind of bottle it up and help people ramp faster when they join the company. And even better, help people know what the culture of the company is before they join the company. So it's attractive to the people who want to be in that culture. And for folks that don't, they don't end up here and feel like they're not a fit. So that's a lot of what we've tried to do is really distill it down.
I think you're onto something which is the essence of making cultural decisions deliberate. Is you've got to lean into what's working, which means you've got to consciously think about it and acknowledge, okay, these, because there's no right or wrong. Everything comes with its pros and cons. These things work for us, and they may be uncomfortable for some people, but we're still going to lean in, and we're going to be explicit about that, so that if they're uncomfortable for people, those people can choose to opt out, whether they're existing employees, but ideally even before they join.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I kind of think of it as almost like product management, right? Like you want to make sure that you've really been thoughtful about what does the business need, and like let's make sure that the culture supports that. And then no single product is for everyone. So you want to be super upfront about that and kind of explain that. So for us, as a company, we have discipline and we also have bias for action. Like these are two operating principles of ours that can be uncomfortable for people because sometimes it's more fun to operate in an undisciplined environment. You want to be able to invest in everything under the sun. We focus a lot on the sort of financial discipline side of things. Same thing with the bias to action. There are some folks that come in that want to be able to explore an idea for 5 or 10 years. We're trying to ship something in 5 or 10 months, right? So it's a little bit different, and that's not for everyone.
Sanjit, before we wrap up, I'd love to spend a couple of minutes on the topic that everyone seems to be talking about these days, which is AI. I mean, you've been implementing AI in your cameras across sort of the very large data sets that you have for many years. So I'm curious, sort of, as you look at sort of the hype suddenly in the last couple of years around generative AI, what are your thoughts on the hype? What are your thoughts on the opportunities ahead and the challenges, not so much just for Samsara, but for the ecosystem at large?
Yeah. So AI for us was really a practical solution to a big problem, which was all the data, right? Like if you think about how much data comes off of all these field operations, we were seeing trillions and trillions of data points of GPS and HD video coming in, et cetera. And we knew that there was going to be no way that a person or team of people could filter all of that, right? So you had to write software for it. And that effectively was AI, right? Like, could you go detect distracted driving, which really only happens a small fraction of the time. Most of the time, people are driving really well. But can you go find that bad habit and then train the camera or train a model in the camera to detect it instantly, right? We did that several years ago, and it changed the game for our customers because now all of a sudden they could break the habit and break the risk. So for us, it was always a very practical solution to a very practical set of problems. I think what people are excited about now is, wow, this, at least with generative AI, this could be useful in lots of different domains. Like LLMs, I think everyone had the Chat GPT moment where you say, this is really powerful, this is really compelling. And I think the danger with any hype cycle is then you feel like you got this hammer and you're just going to like go around looking for a nail. We've always kind of tried to take the opposite approach of like, what is going on in the world of the customer and how might this be useful? So for us, generative AI would be can you help fill out a form or paperwork, right? Based on a bunch of context that you have about the asset that you're inspecting or where you are or something. Gen AI can fill out that form or at least put in a bunch of presets in a way that saves the person a lot of time. So we are excited about this kind of stuff, but in a very kind of pragmatic sense. And we're working backwards from what would be really useful to the customer. Seems to me like there are lots of companies figuring out the same pattern. So I'm still really excited about it, but I think you have to kind of work backwards from what's going to be useful to the customer versus working forward from the hammer that everyone just discovered.
How do you think about that trade-off between both the opportunity and the constraints that having skill gives you in the context of trying new things in AI?
Yeah, for us, the scale advantage is actually the surface area that we have with customers because we get to see a lot of different challenges. We get to see a lot of different customers and industries. So I feel, get more signal in that sense than we would as a small company. The challenge is actually inertia. And this is true for any company that's thousands of people. You have people who have a full list of things to work on. So finding a way to carve out time and experiment and take risk, that's why you have to have that framework, for example, around capital allocation and team allocation, because otherwise you're just going to spend all your time delivering the roadmap for this calendar year, which probably doesn't need that new functionality. Like it was stuff that was on the plate from a while ago. So that's the real challenge that incumbents I think really have is the inertia, even more so than willingness to think about new things. Everyone's excited about it. It's like, how do you actually get it done?
Before we wrap up, one last question for you. What advice do you have for, if you were thinking of Sanjit 20 years ago, someone who's graduating from MIT, who's graduating from Berkeley or Stanford with a computer science degree, has some ideas, is starting a company. What are the one or two things that you would have wanted to do differently in hindsight, and therefore you would advise them to do?
Well, I should clarify. I think my parents will call me out on this. I didn't actually finish my PhD, so and that's okay. It works out. So first of all, feel free to take the risk and give it a shot. But maybe related to that is actually leaning in and just doing it in terms of learning by doing. That's how we worked as grad students. But I think a lot of times people get very intimidated by the entrepreneurial process or just all of this advice is floating around. But if you kind of return to your roots as an engineer and say, hey, I just like to build things, whether it's products or companies, just give it a shot and experiment because the downside risk is not that bad. And the upside is pretty enormous because products are super scalable, right? Like you can get them out there. And that's a great way to have impact. So I remember 20 years ago, even back then, I wanted to go see ideas have impact in the world. You want to change the world through these ideas. The best way I found to do that is by building products, and the best way to build products is just do it. Go for it.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Sanjit. I really appreciate the time, and once again, congratulations on what's been a remarkable journey.
Thank you very much.
That's our show for now. You can find past episodes and subscribe to future ones wherever you get your podcasts or at foundationcapital.com. And if you like the program, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others to find the show. B2B as CEO is a production of Foundation Capital, an early-stage venture capital firm with over $3 billion in committed capital and 29 public companies to our name, including Netflix, Lending Club, TubeMogul, and Sunrun. At Foundation Capital, building companies is in our bones. I'm Ashu Garg, a general partner at Foundation Capital. I'm passionate about helping B2B entrepreneurs who are trying to solve hard problems. So if this podcast speaks to you, if you're a technical founder who's interested in scaling an enterprise startup into a massive business and scaling themselves into a true CEO, drop me a line.